Hello, welcome back to BPM 232, Buddhism and Psychology, Buddhist Psychology. And welcome to Lecture 9. So this is the first part of a two-part lecture on the nature of self. And we're going to cover a few things in sequence between this part and the next part. So it is kind of a continuity between the two parts. Okay, so when we're talking about the nature of self in Buddhism, what is the nature of self? Okay, ready? This is really complicated. There isn't one. Doesn't that feel good? We're done. Except that doesn't quite discharge it, does it? We've covered enough at this point that you will have a sense of the notion of impermanence, right? You will have a sense of the kind of change and compositionality that make up phenomena, generally speaking, and the mind specifically. As I had mentioned in the last lecture, there are lots of different ways to carve up the conception of the mind, right? And indeed, in different strains of Buddhism, right, in the different Buddhisms, you're going to get different kinds of systems, right, in talking about these things. Our goal here is not to sort of delineate those at length. There is one specific part that we are going to talk about a bit, which is storehouse consciousness, which we're going to talk about. And we're going to talk about it in part because it's a piece of the Buddhist conception that comes closest to reflecting something that's become quite central and integral in the Western notion of the mind and of psychology. So we're going to talk about that. But this idea of the kind of flow, interconnectedness, causal interrelationship, and therefore emptiness, right, of the self, of the mind, of phenomena, perhaps generally speaking, this we've covered over and over and over again. So, okay, let's cover a few things though. When we say that there is no self, right, this is in part due to the fact that the self is empty, right? The mind is empty. But to say that it's empty is not the same thing as to say that it's vacuous, right? It's just that there's not a stable, enduring object there in the way that we might often conceive of something. And we've already discussed how that is in and of itself a fairly kind of definitive break from the dominant ideas that were in India at the time of the Buddha, right? Who were largely predicated on this idea of Atman, the sort of eternal soul, right? Atman is Brahman. Now, the insight goes deeper than that, and that's part of what we're going to talk about in this lecture, because although I do want to discuss sort of the general theory around the mind in some portions, and I want to try to connect that up to certain aspects of kind of Western psychology, the other thing that I want to talk about, or sort of begin to talk about, is how do we get at this? Because that's the point that I'm making. When I say the mind doesn't exist, right? It's empty. Okay, great. You now have a proposition. But as I've pointed out many times, a proposition, right? Having somebody hand you a fact is completely different than actually having an experience of something. You name that in countless ways, right? You can read about love all day long, but until the first time that you fall in love, you really haven't quite grasped the experience. Any parent will tell you that until you have children, you don't really understand what you're dealing with, right? Which makes it a sort of transformative experience question. Since you don't know what you're getting into, how are you supposed to make the decision? You're supposed to take it on faith at some level, right? About the claims that they're making. Although interestingly, we have some good science on that these days. So similarly, what I want to start doing, particularly in part 2 of this two-part, is start delineating the specific procedure, right? So in a relatively stripped down way, I want to start looking at the psychotechnologies, okay, the meditations and contemplations that are specifically used within Buddhisms, okay, and the forms of meditation that in a sense were innovative, okay, that were the things that really differentiated in a lot of ways Buddhism from its contemporary counterparts, right? And offered sort of a new way of self-investigation, which yielded not just the proposition of emptiness, right? Not just a fact being handed to you, but rather a direct experience, a means of looking and seeing that, experiencing in a direct sense, and thus dissolving it away. Now, it's important to note, once again, that one of the core conceits, right, within Buddhism is essentially speaking that your unconditioned aspect, right, whatever, the true mind behind your mind, or the true nature behind your conditioned nature, right, the consciousness, the background consciousness, which is the truth as opposed to the upfront set of skandhas, of heaps that make you up, is always there for you. The issue is not creating it, it's not manifesting it, it's not any of that stuff. What it is clearing a bunch of stuff out of the way so they can get a clear line on it. And to that end, another thing that we will talk about in the second part is some interesting cases that we actually see in science of things that seem to be somewhat reflective of the states that Buddhism is talking about. Now, I'm not going to claim that those things are the states that Buddhism is talking about. We're going to be dealing with certain kinds of brain injury and stuff in part 2. And I don't want to say that any of those circumstances are themselves enlightenment. But what I do want to point out is that many of them have an interesting resemblance to the descriptions of enlightenment. And so what they do is open up a kind of fascinating lens, right, from the Western psychological scientific perspective on this question of, what are we talking about when we're talking about this stuff? What does it mean to have these kinds of states? So in part 1, as I said, we're going to talk a little bit about the nature of self, the nature of mind, okay, and trying to kind of get in at this a little bit. We're going to put it into dialogue a bit with sort of various developed Western conceptions of this and see how they dialogue. And then in part 2, we're going to talk about practical implementation at some level. We're going to get to the nuts and bolts of things, and I'm also going to talk about interesting lines of evidence that we've seen in science and neuroscience particularly, and a little bit of cognitive science, that point towards perhaps both the plausibility of this state of being that is described within Buddhism, but also maybe begin to even augment that in some ways. And that's a claim that I'll expand then. Okay, so part 1. Okay, so imagine that you are sitting cross-legged on a clear night, and you're sitting by the edge of a still pond, okay? There are sort of trees around, but you have an unobscured view of the night sky, over which the full moon is rising. It's quiet. You can hear sort of crickets chirping in the surrounding grass. Maybe you can see a scattering of fireflies off in the distance, and you're very calm. And as the moon rises over the water, right, you can see that in the sort of almost unruffled glassy surface of the water is, of course, another moon, a reflection, right? So you watch the moon rise overhead and you watch the moon in the water. Now, if you reach out to grasp the moon in the water, what comes away? Do you grasp it? No, right? You would simply sort of break the surface of the water. There would be ripples and waves and moire, like a kind of chaos, right? You would see a bunch of, right, the simple disks of the moon break into, right, numerous partial reflections. And what you would come away with was nothing, right? Water, but no moon. That is a relatively common metaphor that's used within Buddhism about the relationship between mind and the emptiness of the objects in mind. It appears to be solid and stable, but it's not graspable. You can't lay a hold of it in any way. It's just a kind of image, temporary, transient, right? So when you grasp it, it just breaks apart into water. As another example, often used in Buddhism, take my hand. What am I doing right now? I'm making a fist, right? I'm making a fist. And you can point to this and you can say, right, yeah, that's a fist. But when I open my hand up, when you open your hand up, where is the fist? Where is it? It's not there, right? So where is the fist? In what sense does the fist exist? Is the fist a potential of this? It's a configuration, right? It's a certain state, a relationship of things. But the fist is not inherently there. It's not like when I open my hand up, fistness hangs around, right? So keep these two conceptions, in your mind. They're two relatively kind of common Buddhist metaphors that are used for this, and they're each useful in their own way. Okay, grasping at the moon and opening the fist, right? And in each case, you're picking up something particular about the nature of the mind, the nature of self, the fundamental emptiness and impermanence behind these things. Now, again, I want to underline, is Buddhism claiming that nothing exists? No. What it is claiming is that what exists is process, changeless process, and just process, that there aren't things, at least not in the mental realm, and possibly not in the realm outside either. Things, just processes. And that's relatively well borne out by science, even things that we would think of as being incredibly stable, fundamental particles, rocks, right? If you want to go up that high, right? These things have an appearance of permanence, but they're not in fact permanent, okay? To give you some idea about how not permanent they are, if we return to this sitting by the side of the lake, for a moment, let's consider some of the things around. Well, that water, not permanent. At some point, the water will exchange, it'll evaporate, it'll rain someplace else, it'll break apart into hydrogen and oxygen, right? Okay, and possibly recombine in other things. The trees grew, eventually they'll die, eventually they'll rot, they'll be replaced by something else. The moon, there was a point that the moon didn't exist. It sort of looks, scientifically speaking, like what happened was that the Earth got struck by a rogue body and sort of burped out a big blob of molten rock, essentially speaking, which became the moon. And there is a point when the moon will no longer exist again. That is to say, billions of years in the future, the moon may escape the Earth's orbit, because it is gradually doing that, or it may simply get fried back into plasma by an expanding sun. The sun itself, of course, has a limited lifespan. That's why it will be expanding towards a red giant, and eventually it will, it'll die. It'll burn through its fuel and shrink and contract and die. It's apparently not really big enough to hit supernova, so it'll kind of shrink down into a dwarf star. What about the other stars? They too will have a span and expand. They will go through their fuel and then they will die. And this is a process that has continued around us for quite long. In fact, it is the case that many of the atoms within your body right now probably came from multiple different exploded stars, right? Odds are. Furthermore, if you want to think about process in that way, right? If you think about, it's hard to picture the scale sometimes on molecules, but put it this way, there are more molecules of water in a single cup of water than there are cups of water in the entire ocean. Think about that for a second. There are more molecules of water in a single cup of water than there are cups of water in the entire ocean. It is a vast number. As such, water gets around. Odds are you've got at least one water molecule inside your body right now that was once drank by or in the body of Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan. I don't know, I'm on a conqueror kick here, but anyway, Albert Einstein, Confucius, the Buddha. Odds are, right? And that's just a question of sort of distribution, right? You're full of famous water. So the point is, it's a process. It's all in motion. It's coming apart. That relative sense of stability we have is a function of a very limited time window that we have and our desire to stabilize things. Now, we've discussed this in terms of language already, okay? That language isn't reality, okay? That doesn't mean it's useless. It just means it isn't reality. When we start trying to treat the labels that we put on things as being things themselves, that's where we start running into trouble, right? When we confuse the labels that we put on things with what things actually are. But that doesn't mean language is useless. Obviously, I can communicate to somebody else. It's very useful, right? But it's not the same thing as being reflective of the underlying reality. It's a kind of set of categories that we impose. And we can impose different sets of categories, right? If we speak a different language, it's a different set of categories. We might describe things differently, right? So it's not real in the same sense as perhaps some underlying things are real. And we're playing a little loosely with the ontology here in terms of the word real, but I want to kind of drill this idea in if it's not fresh for you. Similarly, right, if we're talking about language, one way to think about this, okay, that I think can be useful is, for most languages have both nouns and verbs. Nouns are objects, people, places, things, right? And verbs are actions, right? So Anderson is a noun. Toronto is a noun, right? Whereas running, jumping, spinning are verbs, right? One way to think about it is this. In reality out there, right? Reality beyond language, there are no nouns. There are no nouns. Nothing is a noun. It's just verbs. It's just reality doing stuff. Just verbs, no nouns. Okay, so for some people, that also may help. I'm trying to offer a few tools here to kind of cut into this and to get at this idea that, yes, the mind is empty, but that doesn't mean it's a vacuous. That's not the same thing in the sense that we're thinking of. So the moon on the water broken, the fist opening. The mind is empty, but it's not vacuous. It's full of verbs in a certain sense, right? And the world is full of verbs. What it isn't in is full of nouns. Those are boxes that are drawn around things to make them easier to talk about for the most part. For those who happen to like literature, I highly recommend a story by Borges, the fantasyist, mid-20th century fantasyist from Argentina. He's a wonderful short story author and an interesting nonfiction author as well, but the short stories really nail some stuff. And there's a terrific story, possibly one of my favorite, my favorite story of his and one of my favorite short stories, period, called, so hard to pronounce, Tlon Ukbar Orbis Tertius. Tlon is T-L-O with an umlaut N. So if you just put that in, you'll probably find it. But Tlon Ukbar Orbis Tertius, which is a delightful story about a fictional encyclopedia. That's, I think, the best way that I could summarize it, but it's terrific. And among the things that are described as being in the world that this encyclopedia is talking about, the world of Tlon, is a language which possesses no nouns. So everything is described in terms of verbs. So you would never say the moon rose over the pond. You would say the mooning, something like the mooning arced, mooning arced over the water, over the pooling, something like that. Mooning arced over the pooling? I must sound like a crazy person. Anyway, I'm trying to give you a bunch of things just to sort of refresh this and get it in, right? To get you into the mindset, as it were. Okay, so this idea that the mind is empty, not vacuous, but empty, that it possesses no inherent reality and no permanence, that it is composed of a set of interrelated processes, heaps, skandhas, right? That there are a bunch of functions that interact together and that we sort of draw around that and call it the self, right? There are beings, certainly in the world, right? That's a verb, being. But what there aren't are selves, right? Just processes. Okay. So how does that square against, let's say, Western psychology? So to look at this in brief, I'm going to talk about sort of two threads of Western psychology that are sort of interestingly relevant and convergent and supportive, okay? Much of Western philosophy, theology, and psychology has focused traditionally around an idea of self, right? So traditionally speaking, it's the case that there has been a strong emphasis on the notion of sort of the immortal soul and intrinsic being. That goes pretty far back. It's really an outgrowth of sort of medieval Catholic Church doctrine. But you can see it quite strongly supported. And some people obviously have linked it to some kinds of social configurations, okay, within Western societies, broadly speaking, right? So much talk is made about individualist versus collectivist societies, right? Where an individualist society prizes the individual first, and the collectivist society takes as its sort of, fundamental unit of social concern the collective, the community, right? And it has been noted that, right, many of the sort of Western countries emerge from an individualist frame. And some people have tied that very specifically back to the influence of the idea of sort of, the immortal soul, right? The indivisible, immortal soul of me-ness as a unique individual with, no reincarnation, one soul, one life, that's me, that's it. So that has been certainly a dominant thread in Western thinking. However, in the last, let's call it 150 years, what used to be a something of a counterculture position has in some ways gradually become a dominant position in Western thought. And that is the question of sort of not unity of the self, right? Now, it comes at it from a different perspective than Buddhism, but one of the things that I want to sort of outline and demonstrate is that I think that these approaches are in fact somewhat convergent, or at the very least, they are suggestively supportive of each other. Okay, so the two threads we're going to look at, and these are by no means exhaustive, but I want to give sort of a taste in this respect. I want to talk about psychodynamics, okay, a bit. Some of you may have already seen material that I posted on psychodynamics. You may have seen other things that I've talked about this. This is something I lecture about quite often. So we're going to talk a little bit about psychodynamics, and then I want to talk about the more recent cognitive science evidence around questions of consciousness, agency, identity, brain function, etc., and see where those things land us. And I think what we'll find is that both, or I guess all, Buddhism, psychodynamics, and sort of modern cognitive science inquiry around these questions all seem to point in the same direction, which is to say that they all seem to deny what I typically call the unitive bias, okay? The unitive bias. So the unitive bias is this notion that we have, that we are singular unitive beings. We are singular unitive beings, that at some level, right, there is a fundamental identity to our identity, right? That in fact, the self and the mind have, a soul identity and integrity that is stable and consistent. So psychodynamics, the first thing that I wanted to talk about. Psychodynamics has a very old history. It's got a really old pedigree, okay? So in fact, if you want to look back, you can find predecessors of it really, really far back. So one example that I sometimes point to is ancient Egypt. So if you look at the sort of religious and magical systems of ancient Egypt, I mean, really ancient, we're talking 5,000 years ago and further back, you will see that the Egyptians, those of you who have read a little bit about Egyptology may be familiar with this, right? The Egyptians spoke in terms of humans as composite beings, right? We possessed a number of parts. And that in fact, upon death, those parts, in a sense, went in different directions. They went to different places. Okay, so you had different physical and spiritual components. And so they listed out a variety of these components, right? Yes, there was your, physical form, right? But there was also your shadow and your ba and your ka. And these things ended up in sort of different spiritual realms, right? Depending. In that sense, right, for the ancient Egyptians, a human being while alive was a conjunction of, if we wanted to translate it, like a spirit, a soul, a life force, a shadow, a body, et cetera, et cetera. Now, as with most sort of belief systems, there are sort of different lists depending on the time period. Ancient Egypt was a continuous culture for, by modern standards, a mind-bogglingly long period of time. And the culture was old when the ancient Greeks were talking about it. They talked about it like it was old. So, it was a long period of, a fairly large degree of cultural continuity. And as such, the specifics of the terms, the numbers, et cetera, change. As I said, there are lots of different ways to carve and describe things up, and things change in the same way as, language changes, right? However, that basic idea that we are compositional, right, that we have different parts in that sense, it's a very old idea. a very old idea. You'll see traces of it in all sorts of other cultures, where sometimes you will hear about people having, a positive soul and a negative soul, positive spirit and a negative spirit, or human spirit and an animal spirit, right? This goes pretty far back. Likewise, Plato, among the ancient Greeks, right, has a description which he derives from Socrates, where he describes the nature of a man, and we can generalize this out to the nature of a human. And he describes the sort of soul of a man as having three parts, right? Having three parts. That there is, within the soul of the man, there is the man, just to confuse you, the lion and the beast, right? The man, the lion, and the beast. So what are these three parts? Well, the beast is appetites. The beast is physical appetites, lust, hunger, violence, etc., right? Physical appetites, essentially speaking. The lion represents, emotional power and social power. It's about charisma. So you can sort of see this in the image of the lion, right? It's a majestic animal, as long as you don't see it like, sleeping in a weird posture, which is very often what we see of lions these days. But just like, imagine a highly majestic lion. And the idea is it's powerful, it's majestic, it's right, it's sort of looks like royalty, right? So we have the beast, which is appetites. We have the lion, which contains within it emotion and sort of social cognition in some sense, right? Status and things like that. And then we have the man, and the man is the rational faculties. And the man, compared to the beast and the lion, is weak and quiet, right? So what they propose basically is, if you want to have a good life, right, what you have to do is get the man to convince the lion to overpower and tame the beast. That's the formula, right? By itself, the man is weak, quiet and weak, as I said, right? Trying to deal with the beast directly is like trying to shout over the mouth of an open, raging volcano, right? The beast is full of force and power, and right, and the man, blah, blah, blah. Maybe we shouldn't. Okay, but if the man allies himself with the lion, right, then together the two of them have the power to contain the beast, and that is his formula, essentially speaking. Now, notice that that whole conception relies on a tripartite conception of the self, right? That there have to be, in some sense, parts which are operating potentially at odds with each other. If a part must be tamed, then obviously it's operating with a different set of goals, etc., and a different set of powers, in a sense, right, than the man. So it already proposes, in a certain sense within it, this idea that there are divisions, that we are divided into parts, or we are divided into dynamics, and that those dynamics are not always on the same page. That somehow compositionally there is an emergence between the three that yields something that looks like you. Essentially speaking, that you are three kids in a trench coat, right? So Plato's theory basically is that you're a man, a lion, and a beast in a trench coat. And that if you want to really, like, control your life in any meaningful way, then the man on top, the lion in the middle, right? The man has to sort of convince the lion, and then the man and the lion together have to use their combined power to make the beast do what they want on the bottom. And then you've got an effective life as three kids in a trench coat. Okay, so already that is proposing that there are dynamic forces, right? Dynamic forces operating within the psyche, that is to say the mind, that is to say it is psychodynamic. Now, the first modern psychodynamic theorist, right, that we typically lend credence to is Freud. And I put up a sort of a video on this a while ago, so you can check the announcements. But I put a video on this up a while ago that sort of exposits on Freud and the relationship to Jung. I'm not going to unpack that in full detail here. You can watch that one, and it unpacks it briefly, but at greater length than I can do in a relatively short period of time here. However, essentially speaking, Freud's conception, okay, is that we, primarily speaking, identify with the ego, and that the ego is sort of lorded over by the superego and dragged down by the id. Okay, well, that is basically a repetition of Plato's theory. It's hard to imagine that Freud, who was quite well read, was not aware of this. So it's a return to this original psychodynamic notion, okay? The ego is what you normally identify as your consciousness. The id is these appetites, right? They're pulling you down towards the instinctive, the instinctual, the physical, right? Appetites, right? Sex, food, violence. Whereas the superego, far from being the angel on your shoulder, is more like the scolding parent on your shoulder. In fact, you probably internalized the parent and internalized a certain amount of social stuff around this. So, oh no, you shouldn't do that, right? What does it use? It uses like guilt, shame, control, senses of propriety. That's the wrong thing to do, that kind of thing. So they're both exerting control over you. They're pulling on you in this kind of tug of war. And essentially speaking, the tug of war between those two things is in the main what makes people feel neurotic. There's conflict there, okay? Now, Freud differs from Plato in terms of the sort of practical implementation of how you ought to get this worked out. And he proposes systems, among other things, of dream analysis, to try to figure out dream analysis and neurosis analysis to try to figure out, hey, what's going on with you? Because that will tend to be expressed symbolically. And those things link up with his notion of the unconscious, right? The unconscious mind. So what's that? Well, this is the other part of Freudian theory that many people are familiar with, which is the so-called iceberg model. And the idea with this is that your ego, your conscious mind, is like the part of the iceberg that pokes up above the water. So as virtually everybody knows, right? Icebergs have most of their mass under the water, right? Most of the mass of the iceberg is under the water. This is what killed the Titanic, right? Is that, yeah, it looks like there's a little spike of ice over there, but in fact, there is a vast mass of ice just below the water, ready to rip your unsinkable ship open along the flank. So similarly, right, the idea of the unconscious is that most of your mind is operating below the surface of consciousness. Most of it is not accessible to you. There is a small kind of, this is a metaphor, but there's like a small spotlight area of consciousness, your ego above the water. And that's what you detect going on. But surrounding that are vast amounts of unconscious material, unconscious processing, okay? Now, in some ways, that should be obvious. I mean, clearly it is the case, okay, that there are all kinds of processes occurring in your body generally that you are not aware of, right? Like, as I've discussed before, breathing is an interesting case because it straddles that line, right? We can consciously control our breathing, right? But also, if we don't pay attention, we just breathe. And if we try to consciously intervene on our breathing to make it stop, right, we can't kill ourselves. That's why nobody worries about it when kids do it. They hold their breath to get what they want. It's like sooner or later, they're going to hold their breath until they pass out, and then their body will take over, right? It'll have the good sense to take over and resume breathing. I'm not too concerned about that. But the point is that that is a process that straddles that line between the conscious and the unconscious. It's a bit odd that way. And this is one of the things that makes it especially effective, frankly, in meditation, okay, which is something that we'll come back to. It makes it especially effective because it's right on this line between the conscious and the unconscious. But most of your other processes you're not aware of. And frankly, mostly you're not able to intervene on them at all, right? With any kind of conscious, right? You notice that they're happening mostly by inference. So your heartbeat, you will notice if your heart is beating really fast because you'll feel it. You'll feel and notice the effects. But try to make your heart beat faster or slower. That turns out to be quite a bit more difficult. If you get involved in any neurofeedback or any biofeedback, this is an area that I do research in, and I'm going to touch on next lecture because it's relevant. But if you've done any work in that area, you realize actually how difficult it is to consciously intervene on your heartbeat, even when you have a feedback loop for it. It is possible. You can learn to control your heartbeat with sufficient feedback. But normally, that's actually quite difficult to do. How about the temperature of your body? You have any control over that? No. You might know if you're running a fever or a chill, like you might feel weird and then take your temperature. Can you consciously raise your temperature? Consciously drop it? Well, for most people, no, although apparently that's learnable too. Your hormones, your endocrine system. Got any control there? No. Your immune system? You really know, you know what's going on there? That's been an intimate concern of people. People have been paying a ton of attention over the past 2 years, right, to their immune systems. But what is the state of your knowledge of your immune system and your conscious intervention into it, except that you notice the effects? How about digestion? Generally speaking, your digestive tract, your GI tract, you know that something is wrong because something happens, right? If suddenly you're in the middle of a conversation, you're like, and you have to run to the bathroom, you suddenly discover that maybe you shouldn't have left that fish on the counter, right? But the point is that, like, other than the sensations that are occurring, it's not as though you have some kind of direct access. Metabolism, not something you control. If you're low metabolism, high metabolism, you can do things to tweak that, like exercise or, sleep and so on and so forth. There's ways that you can affect your metabolism, but can you affect it through the question of consciousness, right? Through the action of consciousness? Well, generally, no, you can't, right? You can't. And, if people could think about it, that would be amazing. Imagine if you could think yourself into considerably more energy and weight loss. For many people in the modern world, that would be absolutely game-changing, right? Myself included. So the point is, a vast number of the processes that are occurring around you, and let's not even talk about, cell division, skin replacement, fingernails. To note Borges again very quickly, I'm going to mangle his quote, but Borges has a lovely quote where he says, "I prefer to spend my time in contemplation of the mysteries of the universe and God, of infinity and paradox and so on and so forth. But all my body seems interested in doing is making more toenails." I'm quite fond of this quote. Point being, most of the processes that constitute you, you have no conscious access to. The notion of the unconscious simply extends that idea, right, to your mental processes as well. There are all kinds of processes which are occurring that support the mental activity that you identify with, right, within your ego, your conscious ego, right, but that themselves are unconscious, right? Now, at a simple level, this should be kind of obvious. So think about just when you, think about when you experience lethologica. I can't remember if I explained this in an earlier lecture. It is something I talk about sometimes. What's lethologica? Lethologica is when you can't remember a word, right? So you know it, you know the word, but you can't like put your finger on it. It's on the tip of your tongue, right? Oh, that word, it's a word, it's right. You've had this experience, I'm sure, right? Every time I have the experience, the first thing that my brain coughs up is lethologica. And I'm like, yes, I know that's the name for what's happening to me, but that's not what I'm looking for, right? I'm looking for something else. And it's like, lethologica? No. So lethologica, having something on the tip of your tongue, right? Having something. Well, think about for a second what's happening there. It's a weird experience a little bit if you really consider it. Because you know the word, right? And you know that you know the word. You have like metacognitive access. You know that you know the word, and yet you can't produce the word. Think about how you find your way to that. Often what you have to do is like, you can take kind of a back route, right? You can get a set of associations. You may have something kind of close. It's like, whoa, Weeble, Weasley, woebegone, right? You can sort of feel things maybe that are in the proximity that might be right and it might not, right? You can kind of work your way there in an alternate method if you're trying to scare it up, but often it's like stubborn and block it. Okay, so where is it? I mean, that's a funny question because it's not really space. This isn't a question of space, but think about it for a second. It's not in your consciousness, because if it was, you'd have access to, but you do have it at some level, right? So where, right? Now, again, I'm going to say that's a metaphor, because space is not, in fact, what's happening in your mind in some sense. And so set that aside. But even as a metaphor, like if it's not in your consciousness, but it is in your mind, where is it? Same goes for things that you forgot, but you didn't completely forget. Oh yeah, I remember that, right? Past memories. So, you, I don't know, go home for the holidays or something, and your family is making some relatively traditional dish, and you smell it, and all of a sudden you have a memory of being 8 years old, right? That's a classic. Proust, describes this in some detail in Remembrance of Things Past, the sort of first section of his opus Swann's Way. And or did I just get that backwards? Damn. Anyway, Proust describes it when he talks about dipping a Madeleine, a kind of cookie, into tea, right? So this Madeleine and tea effect is pretty well recognized. It all rushes back to you. Smell is especially good for that because it bypasses your frontal lobe. Okay, so clearly the memory was somewhere up there, right? But you didn't have regular access to it. Even if somebody had asked you, you might not have remembered the thing in question, right? We know that there is such a thing as like recovered memory, repressed memory, that happens, right? Even consider, and this is all in a family, obviously, but like consider that thing where, you go to an exam and you're like, oh God, I know this, but I can't, right? You just kind of can't seem to grasp it. And then you leave and immediately afterwards, you're like, oh yeah, right? This is, one of the problems with studying, which is that people mistake recognition for internalization. And those are two different things, but we're not going to get into that. You should practice for an exam basically by writing an exam. Like you should set up questions and try to answer them because you should practice the thing that you're actually going to do. Otherwise, what you mostly might get is recognition. Oh yeah, I remember this. Oh yeah, I remember this. But then you go to call it up and you're like, you can recognize it, but not produce it. Anyway, point being, this stuff in general is inside the unconscious. Now, we can also take as an example, and one that Freud found quite significant, right? Dream. So when you're having a dream, if you happen to believe, standard naturalistic metaphysic, okay, you are having an experience that is in some sense inside your head, right? You're asleep, your eyes are closed, you're not going anywhere. We're assuming for a second that your mind hasn't been projected into an alternate dimension, okay? If that turns out to be the case, then this theory is sort of up in the air. But let's just assume for a second that this is happening in your head. Okay, so you have this dream and, you're at, Aunt Hattie's farm, except her farm house isn't really a house. It's more like an airplane hangar, and there's like an ice sculpture there, and there's somebody there, and it sort of looks like Matthew McConaughey, but also it sort of looks like the Pope. And right, he hands you a book and you go to look at it and it turns out it's glued together, and right, okay, all this peculiar stuff may be happening in the dream, some of which you recognize, some of which you don't, some of which may strike you as odd, much of which won't. Okay, the question from the perspective of the unconscious is, where is that stuff coming from, essentially speaking? I mean, you are there in a somewhat dialed down form, right? You're watching the dream, you're witnessing it, you're experiencing it, possibly even interacting with it. But what about all the rest? Sort of who are the other actors? Who makes up the plot? Who makes up the space? Who selects the set dressing, right? Where are the details coming from? Right? So for Freud, part of the answer with this is they're emerging from the unconscious. And what this suggests in part is that the unconscious is capable of, in a sense, structured, intelligent action, but it is not the same as your conscious mind. It is a mind, and it has its own motives, its own interests, and its own powers in a certain sense, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's on the same page as your conscious mind. When those two things are badly out of alignment, then you start looking at neurosis, right? Where people are in some sense at odds with part of their unconscious mind. Now, as I said again, this is a highly, highly, highly compressed account of this, and I would encourage you to go, watch a video that I posted up that covers this stuff in somewhat more detail. But the basics of psychodynamics, okay, are this notion, right, that we're not singular unit of beings. Okay, now, oh, I'm not going to have quite enough time. I'm maybe going to have to carry much of the science part into the second part. That's okay. Okay, so maybe that's what I'll do. Let me hold that here for now. If you haven't watched it, watch the video that I posted up on sort of Jungian psychodynamics, okay? Because it'll cover Freud and it'll cover Jung to some extent and this idea of psychodynamic forces. And then in part two, we're going to jump into science and we're going to jump into practicality. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about other science. So we're going to talk about sort of cognitive science support for multiplicity of being, right? So cognitive science support against the unit of bias that therefore supports sort of the Buddhist notion of anatta, of no self. And then we're going to talk about practicalities, which is to say, okay, how do we implement the techniques of seeing? And then we'll come back and I'm going to look at some primarily sort of neuropsychological instances where it seems as though people have experienced things which, while not themselves an enlightened state, that's not the claim I'm making, nevertheless are interestingly reflective of enlightened states. They seem to pick up aspects of it, which both render the state that is described within the Buddhist text plausible, but also maybe start pointing us in the direction of what is happening when this happens. So that will all happen in part 2. Okay, so part 1 was a somewhat high-speed introduction. Obviously, part 2 is going to have to be longer to accommodate that. So join me for part 2 shortly. Thanks.